On a quiet Sunday evening in July of 2026, in the middle of a summer already dominated by war headlines out of the Middle East, the President of the United States picked up his phone and posted 18 words that would ripple through Washington for days. Republicans should add Iran to the Russian sanctions bill, Donald Trump wrote on Truth. Social. That's what Lindsay wanted to do, and it was going to happen. Important. 3 sentences, a handful of exclamation points, and suddenly one of the most consequential pieces of legislation moving through Congress this year had a new target, a new urgency, and a new emotional weight, because the Lindsay in that post was not some abstract political reference. It was Lindsey Graham, the veteran senator from South Carolina, one of the most recognizable foreign policy hawks in modern American politics, and a man who had died less than 2 weeks earlier, suddenly of a ruptured aorta, just hours after stepping off a plane from Kiev. To understand why a single social media post about a sanctions bill could carry this much weight, you have to understand everything that came before it. A war with Russia that has ground on for years, a war with Iran that has exploded back to life after a ceasefire nobody quite trusted in the first place, and the death of a senator whose entire career in many ways had been building toward exactly this legislative moment. Start with the bill itself, because the details matter enormously here. It is formally known now as the Senator Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia Act, and its roots go back to April of 2025, when Graham first introduced it alongside Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, an unlikely pairing that became, over time, one of the more durable bipartisan alliances in a Senate defined by division. The original idea was blunt and aggressive. Punish any country still buying Russian oil and gas by hitting them with steep tariffs, as high as 500% in the earliest draft, an economic sledgehammer meant to choke off the revenue-keeping Vladimir Putin's war. Machine running in Ukraine. For more than a year, the bill sat largely stalled, caught in the familiar Washington gravity well of competing priorities, procedural hurdles, and a White House that, for much of that period, seemed more interested in negotiating directly with Moscow than legislating against it. But something shifted in the weeks before Graham's death. He announced publicly that a breakthrough at the 500% blanket tariff was reworked into something more targeted, mandatory sanctions and tariffs aimed specifically at the top 5 buyers of Russian energy, a group of countries that, as it happens, includes some of the largest economies on Earth. And then, before the revised bill could even be formally reintroduced, Graham was gone. His death landed hard in Washington, not just because of who he was, but because of the timing. He had just returned from Ukraine, where he had spent years cultivating a personal relationship with President Volodymyr Zelensky, positioning himself as one of Kiev's most reliable champions on Capitol Hill, regardless of which party held the White House. Trump, in the hours after Graham's death, called him one of the greatest people and senators he had ever known, described their final phone call, and made clear, almost immediately, that he wanted the sanctions bill to move forward as a kind of living tribute. Within days, a bipartisan group of more than 60 senators, an extraordinary number in an era when even routine legislation can struggle to find 60 votes, introduced the revised bill under Graham's name. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said it was something lawmakers had been interested in for a long time. Democratic Senator Jane Shaheen, the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, framed it as a fitting tribute to a colleague's legacy. And in the House, Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul prepared to introduce a companion version, describing it in blunt 3-part language. A bill that punishes Russia, hurts Iran, and hurts China all at once. That 3-part framing is the key that unlocks why Trump's push to add Iran matters so much, because it reveals something that outside observers sometimes miss about modern sanctions legislation. These bills are rarely about a single country in isolation. They are about the tangled economic relationships that connect adversarial nations to one another, the shadow trade networks, the oil tankers that quietly change flags and paperwork somewhere in the middle of the ocean, the financial workarounds that let sanctioned regimes keep functioning even under enormous pressure. Iran has spent years serving as both a beneficiary and a partner of Russia's wartime economy, trading drone technology for oil expertise, coordinating on sanctions evasion, building a relationship of mutual convenience between 2 governments that have found themselves isolated by much of the international community for very different reasons. Add Iran to a bill originally built to punish Russian oil buyers, and you're not just confrontation with Tehran as 2 fronts in the same broader struggle. And the Iran conflict, by the time Trump made his post, had already spiraled far beyond, where almost anyone expected it to be a year earlier. The chain of events stretches back to late February of 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a devastating wave of airstrikes on Iran, killing the country's supreme leader and a significant number of senior officials, and setting off a full-scale war that pulled in missile and drone strikes against Israel, against American bases scattered across the Gulf, and a genuinely alarming closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a massive share of the world's oil supply normally flows. What followed was a herky-jerky cycle of escalation and de-escalation that would come to define the entire year. A ceasefire brokered with Pakistani mediation in April, further strikes and blockades in May, a fragile memorandum of understanding reached in mid-June that promised to lift sanctions on Iran in exchange for winding down its nuclear ambitions. And then, by late June and into July, the whole fragile structure beginning to crack. Iran struck commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The United States responded with retaliatory strikes. Trump, standing on the sidelines of a NATO summit, declared flatly that the ceasefire was over, using language sharply critical of Iran's leadership. The exchanges intensified from there, American strikes hitting targets across multiple Iranian provinces, Iranian forces, striking American allies in Bahrain and Kuwait, ballistic missiles fired at a U.S. base in Jordan, global oil prices spiking as traders absorbed the reality that the world's most important energy corridor was, once again, an active war zone. By the time Trump made his Truth Social post about the sanctions bill, the United States had just endured its first combat deaths of this renewed phase of the conflict. American service members killed in an attack in Jordan, with another reported missing, and the country had entered its 8th consecutive night of retaliatory strikes against Iran. This is the atmosphere in which Trump's call to add Iran to the Russia sanctions bill has to be understood, not as an isolated legislative suggestion, but as one thread in a much larger, much more volatile tapestry. And there is a genuinely striking irony buried inside this moment, one that deserves to be stated plainly because it says something important about how quickly the ground can shift in modern foreign policy. Just weeks earlier, Trump had signed off on that memorandum of understanding with Iran, a document that explicitly promised, in its own language, to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic as part of a negotiated peace, unilateral sanctions, United Nations. Resolutions, the entire architecture of decades of pressure. Now, with that agreement effectively in ruins and Iran's own leadership publicly describing Trump's signature on it as worthless, the president was calling for the opposite, not sanctions relief, but sanctions expansion, folding Iran directly into one of the most aggressive economic pressure campaigns currently moving through Congress. It is a reversal that reflects, more than anything, how fluid this entire relationship has become, how quickly a memorandum of understanding negotiated in one moment of relative calm can be rendered obsolete by the next wave of missiles. There is also a Russia dimension to this that runs deeper than simple bureaucratic bundling, and it connects to something Trump himself has been signaling with growing frequency over the summer, a hardening frustration with Vladimir Putin. For years, critics of the administration argued that Trump's instinct toward Moscow was fundamentally conciliatory, that his preference for direct negotiation over sanctions reflected a broader skepticism about whether economic pressure campaigns actually work. Trump has said as much himself in the past, arguing publicly that sanctions tend to push countries and businesses away from the U.S. financial system, rather than bringing them to heel, and pointing to his own preference for tariffs as a more effective form of leverage. It is worth remembering, as an honest documentary must, just how dramatically the use of sanctions expanded under the previous administration, reaching an extraordinary number by 2024 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, only to decline under Trump's approach in the years since. But by the middle of 2026, with Putin refusing to move toward any credible end to the war in Ukraine despite months of on and off negotiation, that patience appears to be wearing thin. Trump's public rhetoric has increasingly signaled support for tougher measures against Moscow, even as he continues to insist that his preferred outcome is still a negotiated settlement rather than a purely punitive one. Folding Iran into the same bill, then, becomes a way of applying pressure on two fronts simultaneously, using a single piece of legislation to signal resolve against both Moscow and Tehran, at a moment when both relationships have deteriorated badly and simultaneously, an alignment of crises that even seasoned foreign policy hands describe as unusual. Not everyone in Washington sees this as a clean, uncomplicated win, and a fair accounting of this story has to include the real reservations being raised, mostly from Democrats, about what exactly this bill would authorize once it becomes law. Buried in its text is language granting the president sweeping tariff authorities, powers that some lawmakers worry could be applied unpredictably or expanded well beyond their original intent, concerns that were significant enough to draw attention even while a related case over. Presidential tariff powers was working its way through the Supreme Court. There is a recurring tension in American sanctions policy between the desire to move quickly and decisively against foreign adversaries and the constitutional discomfort many in Congress feel about handing any single president of either party that much unilateral economic power. Shaheen and other Democrats who support the broader goal of punishing Russia have been careful to note that their support for this bill is not unconditional, that the specific mechanics of how tariff authority gets distributed and constrained will shape whether this ultimately passes with the overwhelming bipartisan support its sponsors are hoping for, or whether it becomes another flashpoint in the ongoing argument over how much economic warfare power belongs in the hands of the executive branch alone. Then there's China, mentioned almost in passing by Congressman McCall, but sitting quietly at the center of the entire calculation. Any serious sanctions regime targeting buyers of Russian energy inevitably runs into Beijing, which has become one of Moscow's largest customers for discounted oil throughout the war, a relationship that has helped cushion the Russian economy against the very isolation these sanctions are designed to inflict. Add Iran to the mix, another country with its own complicated, sanctions-evading energy relationship with Chinese buyers, and the bill starts to look less like a narrow response to one war and more like a broader attempt to reshape the economic incentives of the entire authoritarian bloc that Washington increasingly views as aligned against it: Russia, Iran, and China, three governments with very different histories and very different grievances against the United States, now potentially bound together inside the same piece of American legislation. That is an enormous undertaking for any bill to carry, and it raises the stakes of every procedural fight ahead, every amendment, every committee hearing, because the version of this legislation that eventually reaches Trump's desk, if it does at all, will carry implications far beyond the war in Ukraine that originally inspired it. It is also worth pausing on the human dimension running underneath all of this policy machinery, because it is easy, in a story built around sanctions mechanisms and tariff percentages, to lose sight of the fact that this entire legislative push is happening under the shadow of genuine recent grief. Lindsey Graham was, whatever one thought of his politics, a singular figure in the Senate, a man capable of forging deep personal relationships across the aisle, even as he became one of Trump's most reliably combative defenders in his later years. His memorial service drew tributes from lawmakers of both parties. His Senate desk sat draped in black cloth when the chamber reconvened for the first time after his death. And now his name sits attached permanently to a piece of legislation that may end up reshaping how the United States confronts three of its most serious adversaries at once. There is something almost classically American about that. A piece of hard-edged, consequential foreign policy legislation being carried forward not purely through calculation, but partly through the emotional momentum of honoring a colleague who cannot see it through to the finish line himself. Whether that momentum is enough to overcome the genuine, substantive disagreements still standing between the bill's supporters remains an open question. What happens next unfolds on two tracks simultaneously, and both deserve to be watched closely by anyone trying to understand where American foreign policy is heading in the back half of 2026. On one track, there is the legislative process itself. The House companion bill McCall was preparing to introduce. The committee, hearings, the negotiations over exactly how much tariff authority the president should hold and under what constraints, the question of whether more than 60 senators translates into the votes needed to actually send this to Trump's desk, and whether Trump, once it arrives there, signs it as enthusiastically as his social media posts suggest he will. On the other track, there is the war itself, still unfolding in real time in the skies and waters around Iran, a conflict that could de-escalate again just as unpredictably as it reignited, or could continue grinding forward through further strikes, further casualties, further disruptions to global energy markets that have already sent oil prices lurching upward. The relationship between these two tracks is not incidental. Congress moves at the speed of committee calendars and floor schedules. Wars move at the speed of missiles, and negotiations conducted in back channels nobody outside a small circle of officials ever sees. A sanctions bill drafted with one geopolitical picture in mind can find itself, by the time it actually becomes law, responding to a completely different set of facts on the ground. What is clear, and what can be said with real confidence, is that a threshold has been crossed rhetorically, even if the legislative outcome remains uncertain. For the first time, a sitting American president has explicitly called for Iran to be folded into a Russia-focused sanctions framework, treating the two governments not as separate problems to be managed individually, but as connected nodes in a single, interlocking challenge to American interests. Whether Congress agrees, whether the final bill matches the ambition of that framing, and whether any of it meaningfully changes the calculus in Moscow or Tehran are all questions that only time and the next several months of votes, strikes, and negotiations will answer. But the Post is out there now, 18 words on a summer Sunday night, carrying inside it the memory of a senator who did not live to see whether his last major legislative push succeeds, and a preview of just how tightly connected America's confrontations with Russia and Iran have become, whether official Washington fully intended it that way or not.